Why can't we start our own schools? That's the famous question that Bob Moses from SNCC asked during Freedom Summer of 1964. It's a question that still remains relevant today, and we're going to talk about it on Freedom Friday. This is Freedom Friday, and you're still not free. Well, good week, good Friday, friends and family who are watching. Today is Freedom Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully you will be freer after an hour with Sharif El-Mekki and me. Today we're talking about independent Black schools, schools that have a folk tradition, schools that were made for us, by us. Specifically, we are talking about freedom schools today, and it's something that Sharif has deep and intimate knowledge of as an experienced person working in the schools or actually running freedom schools. I have only a bystander's interest in that. They're one of the things within our Black educational history that I've been fascinated with. They're one of the things where it proves everything I need to be proved. We can educate our own children. We can design our own curriculum. We can have control of the apparatus that develops the intellect of the Black mind. And that is freedom schools. From my perspective as a bystander, from Sharif's perspective as an educator, this is what we're going to talk about today. So Sharif, first, welcome, brother. How you doing?
Good, man. Happy Friday, man. It's crazy. July is wrapping up within the next week or so, and
I know.
we're on to August. It's like nuts. The whole country is hot. The whole world is hot. And yet still we have climate deniers and everything. It's like burning up. They had an article yesterday. It was like, it's not your grandfather's summer. I'm like, shit, it ain't your father's summer. Like, forget my granddad. Like, yo, like this joint is crazy.
That's
everywhere feels like boom. Summertime in Iran was extremely hot. I'm like, yo, that's everywhere now. I ain't no telling what it feels like over there these days, so.
Hell, they might start getting snow. The way that the climate goes. What's so interesting about thinking about world issues like climate change is that a certain segment of the world's historic population owns like 80% of the world's wealth, owns 80% of the world's kind of means of production. And because of that, gets to call the shots on how we address issues like climate change and climate issue. And what's so interesting about that, and I don't know if I would call it interesting, is that there is a global minority of people who can doom the entire planet with their politics, their miscalculations, their ignorance, their inability to be arrogance. We can all die by arrogance of a global minority who runs everything. So when we talk about things like Black education, for us, we are a African people, a Black people. Many of us are Negropeans, but we are a people with roots. This is our particular story about how do we educate our children to be prepared to inherit the world that they will inherit. But it's also a story that every indigenous people should be asking themselves and telling themselves, which is why when I think about freedom schools, I instantly think about the global Pan-African context, but also the indigenous peoples context of, you've heard me talk before about the Maori people in New Zealand who at some point figured out they have to educate their own kids. They had to pull their kids out of the colonial schools and think through a K through college education track for Maori students, for young Maori people. And they did that. They started just with early grades, kindergarten, first grade, whatnot, eventually figured out there was not going to be a grade at which they wanted to turn their kids over to the colonial schools. So they kept going. They kept adding your grade.
Should we turn them over third grade? No. Fifth grade? No. So, like, can you imagine just each time, like, wait, when do we turn our loved ones over back to
the colonial schools?
To the colonial schools, right? Yeah.
Think about the import of that for us, though, because they started just with kindergarten. They were just going to do kindergarten so that kids showed up with a cultural, kind of inoculation before they went into the system. And then they were like, well, damn, no, we got to keep them for first grade too.
Yeah.
And it eventually got up. They have a full university system. That's how far they got. There's also, if you look at the Chiapas schools in northern Mexico, it's also an indigenous population that took their kids. They overthrew their schools, their government schools. And they created a school system from ground up that was rooted in their own traditions and culture and whatnot. They elected teachers. They didn't hire teachers. You were elected to be a teacher by the people. They had elections for teachers, yes. And they threw out all the curriculum and they started from scratch. So I bring that up only to say the American counterpart to that story for people like African-American people, even for indigenous American Indians.
The treaty schools, a lot of them are called, yeah. Matter of fact, that reminds me, we got to get Diane on, who's been, she's from Oklahoma, Native American, very well versed in treaty schools and very similar to this, like self-determination. And as you would say, CEOs of the intellectual capacity of the community.
The Native kids, in their case.
Yeah.
I think, it's important for us to read other people's stories and then read our own. Reading even the Native schools, they have a very, I think, kind of analogous claim that we should be making with the government. The Native population of America has got a claim, no, we deserve our lands. We deserve our place here. We deserve sovereignty when it comes to things like education and how we raise ourselves, how we govern ourselves or whatnot, because these are the things you stole from us. And African Americans never really made that claim the same way that the natives made. We just wanted equality. Like, listen, just stop beating us. Like, we'll just take that. But the whole thing about some land, some reserves, some sovereignty, the ability to educate our own kids. I mean, the Native American population says, you put us in boarding schools, you stripped us of our culture, our language, our clothing, our way of life. And because of that, we need reparations on that. Part of the reparations is sovereignty over education. So the ability to run Indian schools, right? That's our analog. We never asked for it, Sharif. Why didn't we ask for freedom schools as part of our... I mean, was we just getting beat that bad that we was just like, bro, just stop beating us?
Listen, just, walking off that plantation, you can imagine if folks were just like, all right, where can I just set up, because everybody didn't go up north, right? There were a lot of folks who were still right in that proximity. Like, all right, where can we, we're already segregated. So like, what can we build? And, they call them free towns or settlement towns or whatever, just started coalescing like, hey, how do we start building? I mean, but that's the amazing thing, right? When you think about even 40, 50 years, one generation, let alone two, after enslavement ends, and how much had been built, how much people had invested in themselves and in their children, and all of that, whether it's you just think about it, it's like really amazing. And I think, and imagine the land, when you talk about like being Native Americans being pushed to a land, imagine like where those lands are right now that Native Americans were pushed to, the most desolate areas, places that the white folks like, yeah, we don't want to live there, so that's where we're going to push you. Would have been very similar to, it still is right now, until they figure out like, oh, there is something worth here. Let me gentrify it, or let me put a pipeline of oil through there because we need it now. Oh, we found some gold here, right? Like, until they, they'll relegate you to this barren space, whether it's a school, whether it's community, until they find some type of value in it. Like, oh, we actually are building downtown up now in Philly. So you know what? Now all those black folks who used to live downtown, we're going to move you out because we want to be closer to downtown, right? Like, it's, oh, that's by the river. Oh no, we're going to move you out because we want to be by the river. Like, it's always about what their priorities are. And that includes school, includes curriculum, includes anything that has some type of ownership.
Well, on that point, they will always move you to the most desolate parts. Let's just talk about that for a second. Freedom schools to me, freedom schools to me have the allure and the attraction that are just on its face obvious. The things around being able to control your own education, your own curriculum, all of that. But you also get to control things like time and space and where and the how. You can have schools in places that have more green space and are more conducive to education. Like, because you have that level of control, freedom in freedom schools, you can have them in church basements, but you can also have them like, the Highlander type of experience, and you can take kids out of the concrete and get them into other spaces. And what we know in education, I've said it for the last couple of weeks, I think it may have been an aha to me in one of our discussions. I don't know why. When I talk about the ghetto is a purposefully built entity, place. It's a man-made lake of atrocious kind of conditions to grow humans in. And if the ghetto is a purposely built place, then the ghetto school is a purposely built entity. And it isn't purposely built for all kids. It's purposely built for our kids, which means freedom schools might start with getting our kids out of the worst kind of environmental places to live. I mean, we have schools, the EPA tells you not to build schools near freeways because all day traffic going by areas where there's schools, pollution increases asthma, increases all kinds of different things. Now, when we talk about education, we don't think about these things. Yeah, this is context, right? Like, you're educating my kid in this context. The EPA has told you. Now, in Minneapolis, for instance, we have multiple schools that are right on the freeways, meaning here's the school, here's the thing, and the freeway is right here, which means all the pollution all day long goes right up the hill to the school. Yeah. When I tell you that Black children have had a 300% increase in asthma in 40 years, 300% increase in asthma, right? Something that didn't normally affect us. And I say that these schools are purposely built and ghettos are purposely built on things like environmental racism. The idea of freedom schools becomes kind of obvious, in my mind.
I think it's all, and as you said, the context shows, it's almost like that invisible ink that the kids use sometimes. Then you got to shine a light on it, then you can see it. Like, that's what we have to do for, like these systems to really expose. And I think that's part of the education. I think that's part of the political education that activists are always talking about. I think that's part of the teach-ins. I think when you're talking about like, building in these environmental hazards, and we didn't even get to, the lead in the water and the asbestos in the walls and ceilings and floors. I didn't even know asbestos came in all these different categories till I became a prisoner. They're like, oh yeah, no, we can't. Hey, this is crack. This is bro. Oh yeah, we can't move that. That's asbestos. I'm like, it's a floor. Yeah, the tiling is asbestos. Oh, the ceiling. Oh yeah, we can't touch that. That's asbestos. Like, geez, like the whole thing. What is it, like cakes, like bricks made of asbestos? Like, but it also reminds me of, my mom had a picture in our album I saw a while back, where we were doing a skit on environmental justice. It was a skit about slumlords, and just how, dangerous the living conditions were, and how the community had to organize and stand up. And right. So it's like all of these things, because it's the school, but then we live in less green spaces, a lot of times, particularly in urban areas where they purposely cut down all the trees, cemented over everything. The heat, when that sun kicks back off the asphalt, and just all the things. And then, verm, and like just everything. And then it's like, all right, and learn. And in school, like, you're not really serious, you're not really serious.
Well, let's back up and tell people, what is a freedom school? For those who are listening and watching and saying, hey, this sounds great, have your own schools. But what is a freedom school?
And folks like Dr. Carr would say, freedom schools have always existed, because I think one of my favorite parts about freedom school is that is tailored to the communities that they're supposed to serve. Right. And so the communities determine, hey, we need this, hey, this is an aspect. So this is why you'll see freedom schools all around the country, that some tailor to high school or middle school, or some have college students Some have college and high school students, working in it. Some like ours stops at third grade, or third or fourth grade, so there are all these different, there's STEM freedom schools, there's environmental justice freedom schools, there's all types of ways, but there's some grounding principles around self-determination and that freedom. But I think that so he would say there were freedom schools all the time. If you were in a cave during enslavement, teaching someone how to read, that was a freedom school. If you were in that, you knew you couldn't have a school on land, so you put it on a river boat and traveling up and down the Mississippi, teaching, that was a freedom school. So, all of those were freedom schools. But then, when SNCC was down in Mississippi, and the Freedom Summer with the freedom rides and the sit-ins and so forth, Charlie Cobb said, "Hey, we're registering and supporting and they were schools too, right? Because they had literacy, taxes, and all this kind of stuff. They're like, hey, what about the children and grandchildren? Like, it's great we're working with the adults, but the future is right now in as they would call sharecropping schools, which also meant like, hey, you're only here just until growing season is over, or you're being trained specifically to do our bidding, right? And be in this permanent subservient class, as what they used to call sharecropper schools. And so they started that, in the churches, under trees, in the parks, in people's homes of, hey, let's work with the children and grandchildren as well. And then you fast forward it, Marion Wright, and people would come all over and like, yes, I'm teaching, right? And interesting enough, Charlie Cobb, who, we also love because, he wrote that book, that nonviolent stuff will get you killed. He also wrote the original, and folks can find it on SNCC's website, their digital archives, his initial proposal to start a freedom school in the midst and context of Freedom Summer. So you fast forward to Marion Wright Edelman, iconic civil rights leader at the Children's Defense Fund, reigniting it and really helping to codify some of the training, some of the language, some of the culture, some of the curricula. And then from there, people used that and built on it, and just it spread all out. And so a lot of times some of them would say like the influence of, some of the Panthers on how to do it, what to build. They had liberation school. Every activist community, should also be thinking about the here and now, but then the future. And you can't think about the future without thinking about the education of your children.
Now, I don't want to go off track, but that point is so important because we have activists today who have become very myopic, I think, when it comes to their activism. They're fighting issue by issue. They're not fighting the things of like ignorance within the populations that we need to be smart. So like they're not, when I think about BLM and some of the other kind of modern day kind of activist groups, they put out a big thing a few years ago, the Movement for Black Lives agenda. And when it came to the education part, it was really kind of weak. It was anemic. It wasn't like what you just mentioned, the Freedom School folks were saying, we're doing a good job educating adults. What's the curricula and how are we educating the younger people, right? Our young and our youth. It was more just like, hey, one of our partners is the teachers union, so we're just going to take their agenda for public education and make that our agenda. It's kind of like, fools, no. Did you not read the Freedom School literature? To say, oh, we're just going to put them in the system that we're fighting doesn't make, well, whatever.
And I think that it goes back to the light and being able to really see how all that's connected, to think that that's disconnected. And like, for folks like Randy to sit next to, Dr. Fuller and say, yeah, well, I'm a freedom fighter. It's just like, wait, but what? Like, literally positioning themselves as, we're the superheroes and we have the work and credits in this game. And it's like, no, you don't. You have work and credit, but it's in other areas. Check out Brownsville, check out other spaces,
I blame this a little bit on the age of activists. When we talk about 1960s, when freedom schools are being thought of as a necessity of the overall civil rights movement, you have people like Bob Moses and others. When Bob Moses asks the question, why can't we set up our own schools? behind that question is a lot of talk between Stokely Carmichael and others about counter institutions, setting up counter institutions, right?
Yes.
You're going to have a civilian board. We're going to have a civilian police watch board. You're going to have a this. We're going to have a this. You're going to have welfare. We're going to have a breakfast program for our own people. So counter institutions where we start creating, instead of putting ourselves in your system, we're going to create a system for ourselves to feed, house, educate, govern, whatever our own people, right?
Counter systems and guerrilla tactics, bro. That's how. That's what it comes down to. That's what's needed.
So younger activists today saying, treating public schools and the traditional public schools as if they are ours and our institution, kind of means to me a little bit there's a blind spot in their history, in their understanding of history, because now they've reversed what Bob Moses said. They're saying, why can't we have their schools? Like, what? Why can't we, why can't we not have counter institutions? Why can't we have, their schools? Is that a fair,
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, sometimes when you listen and people are often talking about, even if they don't use the term assimilation, but if 80% of an institution is white, has no real relationship or commitment to Black liberation, but that's where most of our children are. And the idea is like, oh yeah, we can just, permanently assimilate in the ways that will be detrimental to the mental health. Everyone's talking about mental health, but they don't want to talk about positive racial identity. How do you separate mental health from positive racial identity? How do we have all these people talking about SEL, social emotional learning, and they can't even fathom what does it look like for a Black or brown indigenous child in these spaces, right? And the person who's, the curriculum, the instructional coach, the professors who train these people, all of these folks are not anti-racist, are hella anti-Black, and yet we just feel like, oh yeah, but our children, this is a safe space, or we don't need to radically change what, if we are going to partner with the union, we're not coming with demands of, here's the new, talking about the new world order, here's the new school order. Here's the new school system order that we're coming with and demanding. It's like we're, first not recognizing like the impetus of all that and the power that we should be coming to it, the power and the force we should be coming to the negotiation table with. It's kind of like, oh yeah, we need partner, we're the allies, and right, and it's easy because in a lot of things that like the national unions and locals, you'll agree with probably 70-80% of their worldwide or global issues, right? And so it's easy then for them to ignore the discount the education of our children, right? Because we agree with, we might agree with not having police in schools, we may agree with decreasing suspension, and yet still it can still be anti-Black, even if we don't agree with, if we are on the same page or same idea, I shouldn't even say same page, with a lot of those topics.
Well, this is going to shock you. This is going to shock you. Because, times change, bro. Seasons change. And I'm in a season of change in my life. And I have a serious critique, excuse me, of unions, and have had one for a long time, and will continue to have one that's based and rooted in history and understanding of their history. At the same time, I have come to a point now where I believe that unions are far more right than their opponents. They're far more correct and far more allies than their opponents. And in education, we're often aligning with the opponents of unions, who themselves are far more problematic than the unions when it comes to education. Unions, when you just said, yes, we'll agree on 80-90% of things, right? We will agree on ethnic studies. We will agree on the need for good working and learning conditions. We will agree on the fact that you shouldn't have schools in Detroit that have rats falling out of the goddamn ceiling, and water that you can't drink or whatnot. My kids don't have that experience. Why would I want someone else's kids? Why would I want to side with the people in Michigan who are actually thinking it's okay for kids to go to schools where the walls are falling apart and rats are coming out and shit, and there's mold and what, like, can you does anybody listening to what I'm saying right now have an experience with rats in your school and decay and all that type of stuff? No, that's some third world stuff. So when I hear unions stand up and say, we need to make this real, make this right for folks.
And third world is in this country too. So
no, this world is this country is a third world country. In almost every city, you're like a few miles from a third world part of this country. Like travel the country, take a drive across the country, and you will see lots of beautiful landscapes and beautiful stuff and blah, blah. And then there'll be places where you take an off-ramp into places like Gary, Indiana, and other places where you're like, I didn't know people live like this. My kids don't know nothing about this lifestyle or whatnot. So when it comes to unions and they're fighting for things, most of the things, even when I disagree with how they pitch for them, they wouldn't hurt us. It wouldn't hurt us to have more funding in our schools that's equitable across districts and across lines. It wouldn't hurt us for teachers to be treated fairly, and it wouldn't hurt us for kids to have free lunch and a full curriculum and ethnic studies and time to play. So I've beat them up on this agenda before, but if we do freedom schools, a lot of what they're pushing for would be what we want in freedom schools, right? A play. So let's come back to freedom schools. So I don't want to go too far off on that tangent.
Well, look, let me just say I've been so glad to see you, how you've been embracing this your new paradigm, because I think we have to work in community with others, but it doesn't mean that we should become complacent, right? Like we should be just as vigilant in locked arms at the negotiating table. We should be coming with power. You're only negotiating if you're coming with a level of power and self-determination and confidence, right? If we give up all of that, we just come and like, oh yeah, whatever they say, because they have the numbers or they have the funding, they have the budget, they have all of that, then that's where I'm just like, yeah, we should absolutely. Look, I was on the building committee, which means, for those who don't know, that means I was part of the union leadership in my school. Even moving outside of that, having partnerships with folks who are in union leadership, much to the chagrin of some of the other members of the union, like, oh, why are you working with him? He's at a charter school. He's we're because it's about the community and the activism and alliances that will necessarily push our work forward, and being vigilant about things that are like, that don't help Black kids right there, So
here's the other thing, like, if we have disagreements with the unions, because the word you just used, in community and community, if we are in community with unions and staff and others, then when we have disagreements, we can work out our disagreements because we're in community with each other, right?
And you have at least some grounding principles that you agree on, right? Like if you have that, then that's the starting point.
We should be in community. We should be in community with each other and with unions so that we can work out our differences, especially if we agree on 80-90% of things. And there's like this leftover 10% that we, at the same time, one of the things I would push unions to do is, so first of all, I should have said this in the very beginning. You mentioned that Dr. Carr would tell us that freedom schools existed before, existed long before the 1960s, beginning of the so-called freedom schools. There were things called folk schools, and there were also things called labor schools, right? So labor activism and organizing, also, anytime there was a movement to try and organize people, there was some thought about education of the people you were trying to mobilize, right? So there were even labor schools. So what I would push unions on is to not always just be the party of no when it comes to things like, we want to start new schools. No, not if they're not unionized. But this isn't about unionized, not unionized. We just want to start schools, So, we don't like charters because, they take money away from us. And it's like, well, first of all, it's not your money and it's not your kids. And there can be a world in which you don't control everything. Stop being like a megalomaniac, right? Like I understand you want to control some things in education. Good, cool. But not everything I get your politics, but if it means we can't start our own schools, I need to challenge you on the fact that, no, you don't get to become the petty oppressor part two. right? Like you're talking about freeing us in all these other ways, but you're talking about, yeah, but only we want to define your freedom.
Your freedom. Yeah.
Let us define your freedom.
You're in the wrong box. Come in our box. Our box is better.
So that's where we need some negotiation of like,
100%.
no, not only should you be open to this, you also should be starting other schools too. Labor should stop defending the system and start contributing to it in terms of where are your schools? Like if you want future labor organizers,
here's
future
the
labor
model schools. Here's the model school, right? Here's the demonstration schools.
Demonstration schools. That's right? A good word for it. But we've had a couple, and we should mention this. Randy had, in New York, she had, I think, 2 charters that she started. And the goal of those 2 charters was to prove that unions weren't the problem, and that if you gave them full control of schools, they would be great. And one of those schools did better than the other. That one shut down. It was so bad. It got shut down by the state. And that should tell us something with people who want to fight for us not to have new opportunities. Oh, but you don't know how to do it either. So you started a school and it closed. The Minneapolis Federation of Teachers actually is a charter school authorizer. So they have 5 schools in Minneapolis, 5 charter schools that the teachers union themselves are. I would just put it this way. It gives you the ability to put some skin in the game. Stop just defending the one system, start some other schools and work with community. I mean, one of the schools that they have in Minneapolis is with the Hmong community. So the teachers actually support a charter school with the Hmong community, right? Do more of that. So when it comes back to us, freedom schools, I want to keep wrapping this back around. There were, in the tradition, folk schools and labor schools, which eventually became the ideas around activist schools and freedom schools. Now, are all freedom schools the same, Sharif? Are they like, is there one curriculum? Is it like Common Core for freedom schools? Does someone send you a box and then you open the box and you have a freedom school? How does it work?
No, that's a great question. What I would say is they all have grounding principles. And I would say the Children's Defense Fund is like probably the mother lode of curricula, of like the overall programming. However, it again, so for us, our high school students said we need Black teachers. So our freedom school specifically aligns to our high schoolers' demands of we need Black teachers. So our freedom school is very carefully constructed to have a teacher apprenticeship, and pedagogical frameworks of this is how the art and science and mindset of effective teaching, thinking about them teaching later on, right? And I think, but organically, because there's so many consistencies in freedom school about community, about relationships, about curricula, that organically, I've met so many people who came through the traditional freedom school, through like Children's Defense Fund, and became educators. And we even saw that with SNCC, right? Like Bob Moses and others became educators. So I would say, and like the trainers. So CDF, Children's Defense Fund, in their freedom school model, they have trainers in this intergenerational model. So you're part of the program, and then you elevate to become a trainer. And you could be a Ella Baker trainer. In Philly, they have William Still trainers, right? And so these are folks who've graduated from the program and are training. So a lot of those principles are the same. A lot of the chants and cheers and freedom songs, because remember, these have roots in Black tradition, and where we communicate through song, both, hey, we're about to run away, or hey, we're organizing, or hey, we love you and we love our community. All of those type of things are baked in. But it's also, if you saw Ms. Ball, who trained the Kip founders, the 2 white men who started Kip, who learned at the feet of Ms. Ball, and when you would hear her chants and cheers, you would be like, wow, that looks like freedom school. And I don't know if she may not have had any association, but it's Black teaching traditions, as Dr. Lassane, talked about a few months ago on 8 Black Hands, right? Like, what's grounded in the teaching traditions in our communities, and how can we use that as part of the training to develop these intergenerational leaders? So a lot of the curriculum, but again, every region, every city has their own. So you look at Nicole Hannah Jones and her freedom schools in Iowa. They may look a little bit different than Dr. Bettina Love's freedom schools. But they'll have the say. I can almost guarantee they'll have the same core principles about literacy, about cultural not only relevance and competence, but cultural proficiency and respect, right? Community building, parental engagement, some type of service learning project, right? Like all of those things would still be no matter where you go.
I look at the Children's Defense Fund freedom schools thing, and they point out 4 things that are in all their schools: high quality academic enrichment through research-based multicultural social justice and conflict resolution curriculum known as integrated reading curriculum, parent and family development, civic engagement and social action, and nutrition, health, and mental health. As kind of part of their frame, which is awesome.
Which should be part of any school, right? Like you want that at any school that you have your children in, not just enrichment. And freedom school can also be after school, right? Like there's some who do it as an after school program. Some have it on Saturdays. Some have it in the summer. Some have all 3, right? Like for us, it's after school and summer. That's our Freedom School Literacy Academy program.
Here's part of my arc too in terms of learning, because we all learn over time. You mentioned Kip and Harriet Ball, and I encourage anybody listening or watching, Google Harriet Ball Kip, and it'll pull up like some background on her and maybe even a couple of videos. And if you can go back, her teaching style was a rhythmic, kind of culturally enriching and fun, more environment that she had in her classroom, which Kip founders found to be useful in the creation of their program. But
they should have named Kip actually Harriet Ball Schools. That's what I mean. That's my opinion. That should have been the name of those schools,
Yeah, they have an Harriet Ball Award that they give to people for teaching.
That ain't good enough,
for teaching while white. But when I say my arc, this thing with charter schools, for a long time, there was this conversation around, you're taking the joy out of learning and, blah, 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 joy and play and blah, blah. And I used to be a Scrooge about that stuff. I used to be like, listen, if you can't read a stop sign, goddamn it, I don't want you playing outside by yourself, right? If you can't read, like play could be dangerous. Like, ignorance is a killer, right? So I need y'all to like get math and reading right and science and blah, 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 whatever. And there, so we are in this struggle. This would be 5 years, maybe 6 years ago, this struggle of like joy versus learning, and it was like, no, we need the kids to be orderly and walk in a line and all that type of stuff. And I was all for it. Like, I was like your traditional, like, listen, I don't care how militant it's got to be. We are going to get these kids reading and learning because it serves a secondary purpose for me, which is literate children become literate adults, which means the revolution becomes easier. So if you need to walk people in a line to get them reading or whatever, like the revolution needs this. And, over time, so first of all, I went to a freedom school. I used to have to visit schools as part of, my gig, like just people would invite me and I'd have to come. And I remember the first time I went to a freedom school, they didn't tell me what a freedom school was or what was going on there beforehand. So I wake up on that day and it's just like another thing on my calendar. Oh, I got a school visit. I got a few meetings there, blah, blah, blah. So I go to the freedom school thing or whatnot, unprepared in the morning. I don't even know if I had my coffee yet that morning because freedom schools be starting early. It's hella, the timeline is like hella culturally incompetent because it was like, what do you mean I got to be there at 7:45 or something?
We're one with nature, bro. Like we're one with that. Like the birds are up. Nature. The birds are up, bro. Like ain't nobody sleeping.
That is not one with nature. That is like one with cultural incompetence. 7:45, whatever. I get there, man, and the kids they're chanting. They have morning kind of greetings. They have
chants
stuff going
cheers.
on.
You probably witnessed Harambe.
Yeah, I was in the middle of Harambe. I was like Harambe-sized, right? I was like, what is going on? Like, I thought I was doing a school visit. I thought I was just going to come in and sit with the
just
kids.
sit, Everybody's sitting. They're sitting in rows. I'll read a book to one of them.
Bro, do you know how many times I've read the very hungry caterpillar so many times that I probably could recite it right now. I could probably say it right now, just off the top of my head. On the light of the moon, a little egg lay on a leaf. I could probably go through the whole thing. One of my favorite books going back years anyways, but I've read it to so many kindergartners. And this was not the hi, Mr. Stewart, sit and read thing. This was the
say hi, up. Mr. Stewart.
Hi. So I'm sitting there like energized now. I didn't even have my coffee, and what is going on?
You forgot it was 7:45. You forgot it was 8 a.m.
Okay, well, I won't go that far, but it was still too early. It was still too early in the morning. But I will say this much. What I learned from school visits just in general, period, and this is kind of an aside, was I always liked visiting kindergartners and first graders because the magic was still there. And when I did those school visits, I would walk away feeling more energized, like, oh my God, I always said,
you saw joyful learning.
So, and just I saw still the promise of kids. It was before they became bored, and it was they still were happy.
The light was still in their eyes. Yeah, they were they still had joy in curiosity and learning, and even if they weren't being instructed well,
I've always said if I became a teacher, that's the only grade I would teach is kindergarten and first grade, maybe one of those two.
Well, that's probably one of the hardest grades to teach too. I told you before, I subbed it.
I wanted to teach. High school would be harder for me.
Man.
That would be the hardest, because then I'd be like, shut up and sit down.
You better not.
You're thinking too much. No, but in visiting kindergartners in general, I would see more joy, but in a lot of schools, still not even in kindergarten, the type of joy at all that I witnessed that morning in the freedom school.
That's a different.
It's a different
you're talking
thing.
About two different worlds. Yeah.
So I walked away thinking the classic question: why can't all schools be like this? Why can't all schools have this level of? I mean, they're still doing academics. They're still working on your reading through the day and all those other things, but they're not making joy the enemy of joy or happiness or kind of activity. They're not making that the enemy of learning.
Yeah.
They don't have to be in contrast with each other.
They don't. And it's student centered. It's like, hey, what support and human growth and development, right? Like you learn more if you love your environment, if you feel like you're, again, in community with others, if you are, we're all learning, we're all part of a community, right? Because if you take away the walls, kids are learning all the time, right? And you talk about this, you can't stop a kid from learning. And you see right from early on, as a kid is learning how to walk, they're probably giggling, right? They're falling all over. They're failing left and right, but they're probably giggling because they realize like, wow, this is a challenge. This is hard. Oh, you know what? And I got support. Somebody's either holding, I got their pinky or I'm walking towards them with their arms outstretched, right? Like it's with people, it's with community. And for some reason, the way that schools are structured often, it's like the opposite of that. So Freedom School tries to bring that together. That's why even, and that's another thing that's just familiar with all Freedom Schools, starting the day off with Harambe, with chants and cheers, with the theme song. We leaving out, we should probably play that song. I mean, it's just, something inside so strong. So imagine kids always hearing about something inside so strong and like what that means. And regardless of the circumstances, we're going to do it anyway. Because some of the kids internalize so much, with my little ones, when I used to ask them to do something and they didn't want to, I'm like, hey, stop doing that. They're like, we're going to do it anyway. I'm like, yo, don't sing the Freedom School song in here. That's at school, not at home. You know what I mean? So that, it's just a wonderful, wonderful way to start, wonderful way to re-emphasize that we're in a community. We're going to learn as a community, and we're going to, learn from each other. And the youth, and you probably saw Harambe, youth had leadership roles within it. It wasn't just adults directing, do this, do that, do that. Youth had parts of that, owned parts of that, right? And so you're talking about like leadership. You ain't got to be all gray haired and stooped over and tired. Like, no, you can do this. You can lead this space and you can lead us. What reinforcing message is that to a youth? They're like, oh, I'll lead the adults in this space, in this practice. You learn leadership by practicing leadership. And that's another thing that's often, disallowed in schools,
Well, I mean, there's such a move to manage kids.
Yeah. Homogenize it, manage it,
keep a standard order, if we allow kids too much ability to lead or too much, ability to kind of express themselves in random ways, we'll have chaos. Like we won't be able to keep control of everything.
But that's the crazy
So
part, right? Everybody's mission statement says something about they'll be able to do that out in the world. You can't practice it here, but I guarantee you, with this piece of paper, you'll be able to do that. You'll create, you'll innovate, you'll lead, you'll be prepared for the real. Well, I'm just like, but they don't practice it. So how exactly does it happen if you don't have anywhere to practice? That's weird to me.
So we teach leadership skills. We don't let them exercise it at all. They have to ask 4 times to go to the bathroom because all adults do. Like anytime I want to go to the bathroom, I ask somebody after, like, hey, can I go to the bathroom? What's is interesting to me too was like the kids were so owning of the space when I went visited this freedom school, and as an adult, I had to adjust to it. I had to be like, what are we doing? We're chanting now, and we're singing, and we're holding hands, and what do we, and then they made me dance at one point because because guests have to do like a dance.
You gotta enjoy it. Like they're like you part of the community. You're here. You're in the circle. Then you with us, bro. Like
I was like, I'm part of the community. Don't mean I got rhythm. Y'all should know that about me. If I'm part of the community.
Listen, I was just saying, I was just like, even as a kid, I wasn't the one that wanted to do the dance. I do all the other stuff. No, I don't want to be in the middle of the circle dancing. Even as a kid, I'm still that way. I'm like, I'll be in the circle with all of it, but no, please don't
ask me. Don't make me. And I felt like because I was on the spot, I was with.
And Mekki does it this way. I'm like, no, I don't. I don't do it that way.
So when we talk about freedom schools, what do you have any idea what the scale of them is? Like how many there are? Like how many students might be served right now by freedom schools?
I mean, I don't. I would imagine that CDF affiliated freedom schools are over 100 across the country easily. I would even say 130, 150, easily. And then that doesn't count different groups like in North Carolina. Philadelphia had Philadelphia freedom schools, right? And so they got their training and then they're like, all right, we want to make it even more concentrated here in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia, the national model doesn't have a high school component as servant leaders. Philadelphia and other places wanted a high school component. The national was just like, hey, we're bringing all these people, to the to the Alex Haley farm, and I would imagine they were just liability and just capacity to add hundreds of high school students on top of the hundreds of college students, and so they probably were just like, hey, you know what, we're not building that in. But again, back to the context that freedom schools operate in whatever locality, then they're able to do, add what they feel is necessary. And so for Philadelphia, our superintendent funded. So David Hornbeck, who, called out the racist Republicans and ended up, being, sacrificed as part of this, overall politics in Pennsylvania as a superintendent. He funded 20 freedom schools because he looked at that as an integral part of the school district's work. Right. So we're going to fund, so they don't have to run around fundraising, grant writing, skimping and scraping. He was just like, no, this is absolutely critical for our youth leadership because high school students are in it. It supports literacy. It addresses summer slide. It develops, like just the overall way that we want to engage communities. So there were 20 freedom schools, and this was Philadelphia freedom schools. So imagine 150 through CDF, schools, and then all of what it spawned across the country. So it's no telling how many. It'd be really interesting to kind of take a look at that, one day. But
it feels like this could be, as you're talking, I'm thinking about like in my own area, first of all, it's a big need and a necessity where I live, right? Our local district schools haven't caught up with how to educate all kids yet, and kids of color. And a lot of the cultural stuff, because we have Somali families that have grown very quickly. We have Hmong families and Latino families that have grown very quickly. And then we just have always had an African-American a gap between what they know what to do with white kids and what they know to do with Black kids in a formerly kind of mostly white system. There's a
Right.
lot of these systems across the country that used to be white
Hmm.
and are no longer white in terms of their students, but in terms of their administration, they're still trying to figure it out. Like, oh, we're a different school system now. Freedom schools could be great for us, but resources matter.
And they all had the
Like
same
it's
language,
just
whether
so
it's Cheltenham, Pennsylvania, or Minneapolis. Like, well, the school used to be, it's going downhill. You look at going downhill, like, oh, you mean brown or black, and like it automatically, it's bad
going
now. Like,
downhill means like
yeah,
it's Browning.
yeah, exactly.
um, but resources would matter. So our school district, even though everything I just told you, they need to change. I think in a lot of ways they know that, and they're already like working with experts on diversity and inclusion, all that type of stuff, and they have an equity director. So they're doing all the things. But something like starting freedom schools, first of all, I know their first question would be like where the resources come from. And this comes to something we said earlier in this conversation, being in community with folks. Like, I live here. I know that there are these things that we could possibly be doing for our kids. You just said that Philadelphia had this partnership where the superintendent took upon himself to think through how to resource that, which gives me the idea where I live, and anybody else listening to this, maybe a part of this is not everything has to be outside of the system. We have allies within the system. One, go to your superintendent, go to your school board, also go to your state reps and say, as a state, you guys always talk about closing gaps and wanting to address some of the educational needs. Here's a concrete way where you can make a line item. You can put some money in the budget to say we're going to have like 180 freedom schools. First of all, young people need something to do in the summer anyways, and families need a place to put their kids in the summer anyways. Why not put them in a place that has high academic potential and also has strong cultural kind of affirming in the process? It feels like a win-win-win-win if you could put some money in it. If you could
Yeah,
get a state
and it should be.
legislature to put money in it.
And things like this, people are always talking about like the public good. This is the public good, right? And so the public dollar should also be associated with, like when people are doing this type of work, it shouldn't just be like, oh, you better go to the philanthropist. You got to go, like, right, like, and
Hmm.
I love,
Hmm.
I've always used that statement that you said, like everybody can be a philanthropist,
Hmm.
and this is a public good. So public dollars should also support it. So it's not, so people can work on developing the programming, making it super strong, and not just ripping and racing, trying to, collect nickels and dimes to run a program.
Hmm.
And so I think that's, really, really important. So what like David Horbeck and others did in Illinois, the state legislature just committed $17 million to the freedom schools across
Wow.
Illinois.
Wow.
$17 million, right? To say like, yes, this is important. This is part of the where we care about SEL, we care about mental health, we care about literacy, we care all the stuff that everybody talks about rhetorically. This is what can happen. Here's how you
Hmm.
drive towards the
Hmm.
results. You actually invest in it. And so I think the public private dollar combination is absolutely critical for things like this, right? So Illinois freedom schools, 17 million, that's gonna be a different environment and some, you know what I mean, like
Hmm.
programming and
Hmm.
however they end up, designing it, and just, again, matching accountability to the dollars, making sure like, hey, here's what we're going to deliver, here's what we're going to do, here's the capacity we're going to have to do. And we're talking about like black led, black founded organizations that are probably running freedom schools, these community based organizations that are running it, actually having
Hmm.
the resources to do it and do it well. Like these are difference makers.
Yeah, I think we would need to work with all our friends on different sides of the political aisle to get them to understand how this is a unique opportunity, to prevent them from bringing some of their usual counter arguments to the table.
Mhm.
Um, and let me give it kind of just like a brief description of what I'm talking about. So I would think as a superintendent, you could start freedom schools, not just as like after school or supplemental programs, but actually as actual schools, as a matter of fact. Like, you could start
There are
like
a
a
lot of
whole,
examples of that around the country too, including Philly.
lots of examples of being able to start a whole school, like,
Hmm.
right, like, and it doesn't have to be anything other than a district school. You could start these like I think districts underutilize the power that they have sometimes to
Oh, yeah.
create new learning opportunities,
They're like, we're not innovative,
and
we're the
so
district. Like you could be innovative and a district at the same time.
not every school has to be just like a dry district school. I mean, you already do magnets. You can do something. Basically, a school district can create any kind of school they want. They can build one, or they can repurpose one to fit this. But I'll give you an example of how you run into trouble. So in Minneapolis, we had Afrocentric Academy in the late 90s, I want to say, or early 2000s. Afrocentric Academy. We have a school right now called Anishinaabe, which is for American Indian students. And that comes out of, like, American Indians have federal protections and have federal kind of rules that help them establish things in their education that no one else can. But Afrocentric was our attempt to create an Afrocentric freedom type school for Black students in the district who were severely underserved. And, for many reasons, it came into the crossfires because there were people within the district who didn't like running an Afrocentric school because, they were suburban teachers driving in every day saying, I don't know what that really is. And I wouldn't want to teach there and that sort of thing.
They may have read Diane Ravage's material, like Afrocentric is the worst thing for kids. Afrocentricity is the worst.
What did she say? Kids. She said it gives them an inflated sense of racial pride.
Like, you have no business having racial pride, Black person. None.
Listen to this, people who are listening to me.
And this
now.
is the guru. Like, I'll go by Temple University, and professor after professor is assigning this rabidly racist woman's book and materials to future teachers, and then sending them into communities that they have no relationship with besides Diane Ravage and her ilk about what Black and brown, and then at the same time, now talk trash about Ruby Payne, but promoting Diane Ravage. I'm like, I don't understand this.
I think that's really like the thing with our educated Black people and brown people, people of color who go through ed schools, is a lot of times there are, first of all, not everybody goes to college. So that tells you something. They go there, they get steeped in especially, oh my God, they become so kind of insufferable when they go into PhD programs, and they get the standard kind of first year PhD
he said that to
inoculation.
You, right? He was saying that to you.
Inoculation, they start steeping them in Ravitch and these other things. And they become people who feel like they are so deconstructing, blah, 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 blah. And they're not deconstructing the very people that are teaching them, steeping them in this ignorance. Diane Ravitch was against multicultural education, against Afrocentric education, against bilingual education. Her track record is so problematic that the idea that they latch onto her as a current day person who is like so progressive and everything, when she's still basically a neocon, she has always had a loud polemicist voice that just attacked whatever. And today they love her because she's attacking the people that the left wants her to attack. But she's still doing it from an old white woman's perspective. She is the Ruby Payne of education polemicist commentary. She's the Lucy Culkins. She is the thing that people of color should have given up already, but they all want her to write. They want her to write the foreword to their books that they're going to write one day, and they all want her to endorse it, which makes them kind of suckers and sellouts in a lot of ways. I hate to say this about my own people a lot of times, but some of y'all go to college to become confused. That's the reason that you go there. You go to become confused.
Did I freeze or? I'm gonna just keep talking in case it ain't me who's frozen. But yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with that. I think the education and teachings, and as many of our folks would talk about, that's not the only destination to become enlightened. That's why we have teachings. That's why we have community members who may not be formalized teachers, but are absolutely critical to the education of any person who calls himself a scholar, right? Like that's absolutely critical. And if you separate yourself from that wealth of knowledge within community, being proximity, not even just proximity, because proximity is like, oh yeah, I'm coming to, like, being within it, like a tea bag in hot water. Like that's how I've always looked at being in community. Or you could be a tea bag in racist water, right? And it's kind of has the opposite. You're not really influencing that space. They're influencing you. They become the tea bag, and are influencing you as the cup of water, as opposed to being in the community and them influencing. And so I just think it's absolutely critical for that kind of knowledge base. And I think that, again, back to Freedom School, like this is one way, right? And we're just saying it's one way. It's in multiple ways, but like what's grounding about it is the mindset about this is absolutely, it's not supplemental, it is instrumental.
I think
to how we're doing this.
Some of these PhD candidates and some of these folks in these schools, schools of education, should have to go to freedom schools, and they should have to go to other indigenous schools
multiple times.
Multiple times. They definitely should have to study the Maori people and the Chiapas schools in Mexico, and Native American schools, where indigenous people have had to critically inquire around the people teaching them and their educationists. What part of my oppression did you play? So like when you go into these programs, they hand you a set of ideas. The whole world's neoliberal. The only thing wrong with education are the people who are fighting the system or trying to change it, or the reformers, or germ, this international blah blah. And our people come back talking this nonsense. Like they go up there on the hill and they come back from on high talking all this deconstruction, reconstruction, frere, blah 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 blah. And then they write books that basically just support the main system being the main system, and that anybody who's trying to change that are all, some nefarious force.
Co-opted this.
Yeah, co-opted, blah blah. And my idea
is also disconnected the history of Black education too, right? Like
that's the part for me. That's the problem. Is I might agree with you on some of like a lot of reformers do have nefarious intentions, blah blah. So all the stuff you're saying about that big boogeyman, that big kind of neoliberal boogeyman or whatnot, you've gotten lost in that. You're drinking all that Kool-Aid all day long, and that's all you can talk about. So when we're talking to you about street issues in education, like what really happens on the ground, and we're talking about opening a new school, and you come up, well, that's part of a neoliberal plot to kill the system. When did you become part of the system? When did you become like, oh, wait, so you went through, 4 to 6 to 8 years of post-secondary to come out so stupid that you actually believe that it's your goal to protect the system that everybody else should be doing some critical inquiry around, right? Like CRT, we're having this big conversation or whatnot, is supposed to be a tool to look at any system and determine where there is embedded kind of discrimination against us in those systems, including the education system, dummy, right? Like, how are you going to be free when you're talking about like you love prison? Well, that's how a lot of them sound when they come for the, they'll make valid claims about reformers that I think need to be heard. Because if they didn't make that critique of some of the reformers, then I would feel like they need to. So I will support that part. Yes, some of the people coming to reform public education literally hate public education. They hate the idea that the government sets aside any money to educate Negroes, and not just Negroes, Negroes and Chicanos and like everybody else, even white kids. They don't,
group who doesn't want a Department of Ed to be a civil rights organization, right? Like they're just like, just erase all of that. We don't need, what I mean?
So I'll agree with you. Yeah, if you criticize them, I'll say like, cool. But wait a second. How does your criticism of this neoliberal reform property work its way down to stopping me from opening a school for my kids? Like, now you're talking about some ground level street issues, like, because there's all this nefarious stuff up here, you shouldn't be able to start schools. You shouldn't be able to save your own people and take on. I mean, let's be real. Like, you could probably open freedom school charter schools, right?
Yeah, that's my next point. Yeah.
They would say no to that. They don't like charters. Well, even this charter, I mean, is it all charters you don't like? Like, listen, I don't love the like white nationalist charter schools that they're trying to set up in Tennessee. I don't like that. I think that, I don't know if you know about this, but, white folks are starting their own version of freedom schools. They, Tennessee has given Hillsdale College the ability to open 50 white nationalist Christian charter schools.
What's Hillsdale?
Tennessee
That's
specific.
a white supremacist group.
White supremacist Christian college. It's a Christo-fascist college in Michigan that that the governor of Tennessee has given like a free pass to open 50 charter schools of their making, like little Hillsdales. And so it would be their version. If you were white nationalists, this would be their version of a freedom school. This would be their freedom school, right?
Yeah. Well, you know, some of them probably don't look that much different than the traditional schools in some of these spaces. You know what I mean? So
this is true. It's sad but true.
Yeah.
And I will also say this much. I've always said this thing, and people hate it when I say it. Is like, listen, if you want to start little like white supremacist academies, I'm kind of for it, just because.
For it?
Yeah, I'm a little for it.
Because you want to be able to do your own thing.
No, well, that's part of it. For me to want to do what I want to do, they have to be able to do what they want to do. But that's not really the main reason. The main reason is I want them to keep their kids away from ours. Like I don't need them in my school. Like my kids go to a school that's multicultural with different, with white kids and poor white kids and better off white kids and whatnot. There's a mix of people or whatnot. And there's like 50%, 50-50 in diversity or whatnot. And if you could take the white supremacist kids out of the school, it'd just be better for everybody. Like if you give them a place to be, like you can learn, but you just can't learn here. You should go over, like we set up a school for y'all, like just put them together. Like, why should we distribute them across?
Well, I mean, because they're kids. Their cognitive dissonance might just be being next to a little Stewart kid.
Yeah, I don't need my kid to be a lesson.
It might just be because they have this diversity in school leadership and curricula. So when they're at the dining room table and their drunk uncle is sharing all his actual views about, race, class, and power and privilege in America, they were like, that's not my experience. Even if they don't say it out loud, they might just say that, But if there's
they might say that. Or they might come to school and tell your kids something dumb that their uncle said. And then your kid comes home talking about, Daddy, why are we monkeys? What? What?
Yeah.
So anyways, we've got a little bit, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I just want to shout out, because you mentioned, we mentioned a couple of times like this becoming like an actual school. And so there are those type of situations across the country. I want to, one of our gurus here in Philadelphia who started with Dr. Carr, with Sister Erica, Sister Dr. Kelly, Dr. Aisha Imani, who was started Philadelphia Freedom Schools, and then also said, hey, we're going to create Sankofa Academy Charter School, which is a K-12 K-12 and grounded in the Freedom School principles, right? And that's like, to me, that's and look, you already know, you can just imagine the amount of resistance that she's gotten over the years and all the things, because she's about self-determination. This is this is a woman who, and Philly's such a bunch of small towns. Like, this was our next door neighbor, so one of my mother's friends back in the day, like she was literally lived next door. And they were both educators, right? My mom was a little older and stuff, but just being able to see her leadership, her work, and how that model that she created in Sankofa, there's no reason why that can't be, because again, you can be within the district, but you got to have the autonomy to be pro-Black without sneaking and trying, and you shouldn't have to be fugitive in order to do that within the district, right? It shouldn't have to be fugitive pedagogy still now. That's why I love the book. I'm like, wow, a lot of times people still have to be in this fugitive framework to operate within systems, whether it's a charter system or not, right? Because there's plenty of folks who work in charters, archdioceses, wherever, and say, I'm trying to be pro-Black, and here are all the the barriers and steel cobwebs that are tying me down and fighting and resisting me and right? Like, let us give us the autonomy to be pro-Black. That's what I want. You know what I mean? To center Black children, to center their education, to center their culture, in an effort to ensure that they reach their full-blown potential.
God-given. They're born with it, and we destroy it in our systems. Well, listen, I appreciate this conversation. I feel like we've put a couple of, I think one or two pieces of information into the comments for folks to take a look at. There is if you go to civilrightsteaching.org, there is a lesson plan around exploring the history of freedom schools. It's written by Deborah Mincart and Janice View. I think if you just Google it, civil rights teaching, and the title of the lesson plan is called "Exploring the History of Freedom Schools." You can find out more. There's lots of background in it. I found it very interesting, just in that, like, some of the things we talked about there having been previous schools previous to freedom schools, like labor schools and folk schools and citizenship schools that formed prior to the freedom schools. It's just all good information for us to have, that we have a history, we have a lineage of educational health for our people. Go ahead, Sharif. I see you jumping in there.
Yeah. I was going to say, I'll go and add into the comments. Dr. Charles Payne and his team out of Rutgers, they've been hosting panels and discussions with folks like Charlie Cobb and others from SNCC, who started schools. And then on a platform that you host in partnership, Building Black Educator Pipeline, Terrell interviewed the current ED of Freedom Schools of CDF, which is also really insightful. So I'll find those and put those also in the comment section.
I think it's important for us to become educated about these things, to know more than what we're told about the reforms of schools, to know what's our own pathway. What do we own as part of what I call Black educational capital? This isn't exclusionary. This isn't meant to be segregationist. I think every people, we have learned from global history, is that every people have to at some point decide how they're going to educate themselves for power, for organization, for the ability to be a people and to persist as a people. The Cubans had to do this. All of the independent countries of Africa, when they became independent, had to make decisions around how they were going to do this. Some of them carried on colonial traditions, some of them did not. Some of them had a hybrid of the two. But the Maori people, the Chiapas, the American Indians, everybody has to think through what's their strategy to decolonize their children's mind and education systems, and then re-educate them with a focus on cultural health, academic health, mental health, which is hard to have when you are being colonized by a system. And we are still today, when we put our kids in traditional schools that have not thought very much about the cultural health of our Hmong kids and Somali kids and African American kids or whatnot. There is a need for us to do it for ourselves. Freedom schools, for me, is one way of doing it. The concrete thing I will say at the end that can be done here is, one, find out what a freedom school is and go and look at how they're organized, and then start working your civic kind of engagement stuff, like talk to your superintendent about, hey, for the summers, we have lots of summer learning loss anyways. We have lots of kind of kids falling through the crack or whatnot. This could be really good for us. And if your superintendents don't bite, talk to your school board members. And if your school board members don't necessarily bite, talk to a state rep or a state senator, somebody who can put something in a budget somewhere. And this is academic, it's pedagogical, it has research behind it, it works, and it's also good. Just in general, kids like it and have a good time with it. So if I could leave you with anything else, that's what I would leave you with. Sharif, you want to leave people with anything?
Yeah, I would just just shout out to everyone who's doing the work. Continuing Freedom Summers, continuing Freedom Winters, Freedom Spring, Freedom Fall. Like, it's a year-round effort. And I just also want to shout out our team, who's leading Freedom School Literacy Academy for the 5th year. This summer, we have 142 Black and Brown teacher apprentices around the country, teaching first, second, and third graders, man. And it's just really fantastic to watch youth leadership, high school and college youth, teaching and being, intergenerational, being focused, being student-centered, and all the things the health, right? Literacy, positive racial identity, cultural, mental, joyful learning in these spaces. It's just, steels my spine. It emboldens me. It uplifts me. And it's my favorite time of the, of my work, is that is a critical component of rebuilding the Black teacher pipeline.
Well, I love that you do this work. I love that your team does this work. You mentioned Dr. Kelly and others. There's so many, and Shayna, and there's so many superstars in your network of people doing the work that we need done every day. I'm glad you did shout them out at the end here. We have friends that are working on different pieces of this. Of course, Kaya Henderson's reconstruction.us is something I always like to boost, because it is a platform of distance learning specifically aimed at Black families and the Black community.
It's a variation of freedom schools, right? It's like independent, it's educating, it's joyful learning, it's thinking about all the different things of like culture, pride, and skill, right? Like,
and it's a folk school, because I mean they're teaching folk, like we've lost some skills.
I gotta learn. I gotta sign up for some
for spades. They teach spades and dominoes even, which is
cooking.
Folk school, like cooking,
right?
Yes.
Like it's addition to literature and math and all, right? Like that's like
this is so enlivening to me,
and it's a community with others.
The folk school is going to become a thing people are going to hear me talk more about now. Like, even in prep for this, when I saw that, I thought, that's a thing. That's a thing. Teach people practical skills. So anyways, this has been another Freedom Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully you're freer after this hour or more that you spent with Sharif and me. You can find Sharif on Twitter at El-Mekki. It's S and then El-Mekki, all in one word. On Twitter, you can find me. I'm Citizen Stewart on Twitter, and we can continue these discussions. If you have ways that you think that we could be working together, or ideas, or sharing ideas, or being in community with each other, contact either one of us. Let's talk and keep the discussions going. Let's share our advocacy with each other. Again, it's been another Freedom Friday. It's been real. Thank you all for joining us. Appreciate you.